Preparing an application for deployment. Think about what we've developed so far in our application. Specifically, think about what types of things might change in that application as we deploy it between different environments. We're talking about going between things like development to QA to production. What we're going to focus on next is preparing our application for this deployment, and that's our next section around using application properties. Now, application properties are an alternative to us hard coding credentials and resources into our application. They are injected into the application at runtime and provide an easier way to manage credentials, changes, and settings. Application properties can be encrypted and are defined in .property files. These are separate property files that can host specific values for each environment. Think a property file that's titled appdev.properties to hold the development properties and appprod properties to hold the prod ones. Now, to achieve this property setup, we first can create a property file in the source main resource folder of our application, such as american-dev.properties. This property file will be included in our application package. Inside of that property file, we can define properties such as db.port, db.user. Now, to ensure that our Mule application uses the properties we specified, we're going to add an element in called a property placeholder. This global element is going to point to our property file, as you can see in the right screenshot, and our application can then use properties throughout it. So rather than typing in the account name of the database in a field configuration field in Mule, we can type in db.account. And Anypoint Studio will be able to resolve that, as will the Mule runtime when we deploy. Now, again, we're going to want property files potentially for each environment. So resources and credentials will often vary from dev to production, and you can use environment variables in an application whose value must be set when the application or even the server potentially starts. You can use this dynamic value in a place such as the property placeholder itself. So if you look at the screenshot in the bottom, similar to what we were talking about with having properties throughout our app, the actual specifier that says this is where my property file is can be dynamic. In this case, the server can hold an environment variable called env, and when we deploy, depending on whether the server's env value is dev or prod, it can load a completely different property file. So these environment variables, how would we go about setting them? Well, for development, we can set environment variables in a file called mule-app.properties, and we'll see in Studio how there's a couple ways to place this property. Inside of this file, we can set env equal to dev. If we're deploying to the cloud, we have the ability to set these values right in Runtime Manager. The Properties tab inside of the Runtime Manager gives us the ability to specify env equals dev or so on. If you deploy to the cloud from Anypoint Studio, these values will automatically be added as properties from that mule-app.properties file that you saw in the top bullet. For deployments to a Mule runtime on-prem, we can set these variables when we run or start the Mule runtime, or we can set them in a configuration file called wrapper.conf. This is that wrapper that wraps the JVM and controls it from a start perspective, stop perspective, and also from a health check perspective. Now, what about our HTTP listener? Are we going to have to modify the settings within it to support deployments to CloudHub? In this case, we won't. CloudHub is going to forward all requests to endpoints on port 80 to endpoints exposed in our app on port 8081. If we're using HTTPS, it's a similar setup, but instead going from port 443 to 8082. In the application, you have the ability to either hardcode endpoints to use ports 8081 or 8082, or you can use reserved properties HTTP port or HTTPS port, allowing you to specify locally a port other than 8081 or 8082, but when you deploy to CloudHub, 8081 or 8082 will be automatically injected, respective to whether you're using SSL. So let's take a look at setting up properties. In this walkthrough 4.1, we'll prepare an application for deployment using properties. We'll create a properties file in our application, create a properties placeholder element to specify the properties file, define and use database connector properties, and specify a properties file dynamically. Let's get started. We'll start off inside of Anypoint Studio. In this case, you can see I have the apdev-american-ws project available. Opening up this project, if we look inside of source main resources, we're going to want to add a properties file inside of here. So let's right-click, go to New, and choose File inside of our menu. A dialog is going to pop up. Again, we want to make sure this is in Source Main Resources, and we can put in a file name. Let's call this file American-dev.properties. And then hit Finish. Now, very soon we're going to insert some properties into American-dev.properties. Before we do that, let's make sure that our application is referencing this property file. We'll double-click on our interface XML to open it up. And from the interface XML file, let's go to Global Elements. From Global Elements, we're going to create a new global element. And from the Create menu, let's search for Property. Now you'll see a couple options for property. In this case, we want to add a property placeholder. This is going to allow us to reference our properties file. Let's double-click on Property Placeholder. And for location, we can simply put something that's in our class path. Think of this, at least for the time being, as something that's inside of Source Main Resources. So just the name of the file will suffice. Let's put in American-dev.properties and hit OK. Now that we've got our property placeholder, let's go back to our properties file. We'll return to the American-dev.properties. And inside of here, let's specify an HTTP port as we saw in our previous slide. So if we put in http.port, we can put an equal sign in place, and this equal sign can be for 8081. Now you can either have spaces in between these or put them all together, whatever you prefer. Now we'll return back to the global elements inside of our interface XML. So from here, let's go ahead and save this file. We'll go to our interface XML. From the interface XML, again inside of global elements, let's double click on our HTTP listener configuration. Here we had the port hard-coded as 8081. In this case, let's go ahead and replace this with a property. So we'll do $, and open and close curly braces. Inside of there, we'll specify the property key, which will be http.port. Let's then hit OK. For our next set of properties, let's open up our student snippets file on our local file system. Once you've found and opened up your snippets file, let's scroll down inside of the snippets file and locate some of the additional properties under the MySQL database under Module 3. From here, I'm going to have you copy all of the different credentials. Again, yours may vary depending on your student snippets. All the credentials for DB port, the user port, password, database, and copy that to your clipboard. There should be 5 in total. Let's then go back to Anypoint Studio, and from Anypoint Studio, let's go back to our American-dev.properties file. Underneath HTTP port, we can paste in these properties. In this case, I'll put spaces in between to keep them consistent, and we will save. Now, let's check out our implementation XML for a moment to see where we can inject these different database properties. We'll double-click on Implementation XML, and from Implementation XML, let's go to Global Elements. Inside of Global Elements, we'll see our MySQL configuration, which we can double-click on. And inside of here, we once again see all of the hard-coded values. So let's take a moment inside of here to replace these with our properties. We'll start off with host, which will be db.host, port, which will be db.port, user, db.user, password, which will be db.password, and then database, as you could have guessed, db.database. Now that we have these properties in place, not only will the runtime be able to resolve them based on our placeholder, but Studio can as well. As an example, if we click Test Connection in the bottom of our screen, we're still going to be able to successfully connect to the database, even though our settings are in an external property file. Once the test is completed successfully, we can hit OK and OK again. Now let's take a moment to make sure all the files in our project have been saved, and let's ensure that this all works from a runtime perspective. To do so, we can click the Run button in the top of Studio and let this application start. Once the application is deployed successfully, let's flip over to Postman and make a single request ensuring that it's working successfully. To do so, we'll go to HTTP, localhost 8081. In this case, let's call out to API/flights, doing a simple GET request to this location. Let's hit send. And after a moment of reaching out, we should get a JSON response back to our client. In this case, our properties are working just fine. But we really don't have the ability to switch between environments just yet, and that's what we're going to look at next. Back in Anypoint Studio, let's stop our project. I'll go to the console and hit the stop button. Now, I want to look inside of the mule-app.properties file. Inside of mule-app.properties, we can set an environment setting here. Another place that we can also set this is inside of the mule-project.xml. So if we double click on mule-project.xml, you'll see a box for environment variables. Let's put it in here just as an example. If we hit add for environment variables, type in env, and put the value inside of here as dev, and then if we save this after making changes, we can go back to the mule-app.properties file and see that it's automatically generated this property file. So whichever location you want to insert these into is completely up to you. Now that we've got an environment variable set inside of mule-project.xml and mule-app.properties, we should have the ability to use this property in our placeholder. Let's return to our interface XML. And in the interface XML, let's double click on our property placeholder. Now eventually when we get into deployments, we want to be able to switch between environments. In this case, we're set to do only the dev properties. Let's fix that. Instead of saying dev, we're going to put in another property, and in this case say env, allowing our runtime to know what environment it's part of and then load the appropriate properties file. Let's go ahead and hit OK, save the project altogether, and in this case there shouldn't be any functional difference, but let's just make sure we haven't made any mistakes. We'll run the application again. Once the application has started up, let's flip back to Postman on our computer. And from Postman, let's be sure to send a fresh request in. If we get a successful response back, that means our API is working just fine, and we're going to be able to use this environment-based property in our deployments.